I have a student called Mohammed reach out to me. He's an undergrad student in computer science, and his question is, how do we shortlist universities in the US? Let me go through a detailed way of identifying universities in the US. So first thing first, understand which location you're trying to apply for, because the location is going to play a very important role when it comes to finding jobs in the US. So if you are an engineer, especially in computer science, the most important thing for you to recognize is there is something called the East Coast and West Coast for the US. And if you're looking at the East Coast, you're talking about Boston, New York, and so on. And then the West Coast, you've got Seattle and the Silicon Valley Bay Area. If you're looking at tech hubs in the US, where most of the companies are, most of them are based out of the Silicon Valley Bay Area region. So that's where the center is. That's the center of the US tech sector. There are also a bunch of companies based out of Seattle, which is probably the second big tech cluster. The third one is based in the Austin region in Texas. So that's the third big cluster. There's also a fourth cluster, which is in the North Carolina, the Research Triangle. So check it up, just Google Research Triangle in North Carolina. It's in a place near Durham and Raleigh and so on. So those are the places where there's a lot of jobs in the tech sector. So these are the four big tech clusters in the US. So you can see clearly from this that these tech hubs, when it comes to computer science jobs, it don't necessarily include companies in, say, the biotech sector, the medical sector, and they tend to be focused more in Boston. They do not include companies in, for example, the media sector, the Wall Street sector, the fintech sector, and those are based out of New York. So New York has typically been a haunt of finance companies, whether it be fintech, whether it be companies connected to fashion, telecommunications. So there are a bunch of companies out there. So you really have to choose from location perspective, where is it you're going to be in? Because location will play a very important role for you to find the right internships. And most of the jobs nowadays happen because you find the right internship. There are very few direct interviews for full-time jobs. It always happens through conversions from interviews. So this is probably the first factor to identify. Where is it you want to be? If you are near the West Coast, yes. If you're, for example, in California, in any of the university in California, there's a very high chance that you could find a job in the Silicon Valley Bay Area region. But if you are in, say, a different state, it's more difficult for you to relocate from another state to the Silicon Valley Bay Area. That's just a fact. So that's one aspect. The second thing to consider is, where do you want to be in? Do you want to be in a place which is a city-like structure? For example, if you're based in New York, if you're based in Silicon Valley Bay Area, it can be very, very expensive. These are two most expensive cities in the US. Even Seattle is very expensive, and Austin is also getting there. So the question to ask is, can you afford to be there? Living expenses in the Silicon Valley Bay Area can be around $2,500 to $3,000 a month, just living expenses. And you're also paying a tuition of probably something like maybe $50,000 to $70,000 per year. So if you're doing a 2-year MS program, you have to ask yourself, can I afford to be in these places where it's so expensive to be in? Can I be near a big city? If you say you cannot be near a big city, you cannot fund for all these expensive living expenses in cities, then maybe you should consider some suburban regions. For example, Cornell University, the location is very far away from New York. It's in the suburbs of New York, suburbs in New York State. Okay, so that's where things are. It's in a place called Ithaca, and it's super cheap to be there. Likewise, you can choose any of the Midwest universities, for example, Purdue University, for example, Ohio State University, for example, University of Wisconsin, and University of Minnesota, all fantastic places. And the advantage is that it's much cheaper to be in these locations. So maybe the tuition is going to be low, and also there's a good chance that the living expenses is also going to be low. So your budgets really determine where you go and study. If you go to a big city, it's going to be way more expensive than being in a suburb. So that's the second factor to consider, the cost expectations in terms of how much can you spend on the degrees. The third most important component is, what are you going to study for? If you're going to go for an MS program, most of the US universities are not going to give you funding. And you'll have to self-sponsor your own degree. But if you're applying for a PhD program and you get selected, there's a very good chance of funding. And most PhD students, I would say 99% of the PhD students in engineering do get funding. They get some research assistantships, teaching assistantships, and so on. So this will not only give you a stipend, but will also pay for your living expenses. So that's something you got to look into. What is the course you're going to work on? So the course is going to determine your funding scenario, and then you can play around. Typically, a PhD degree takes 5 years, and an MS degree takes around 2 years. So this is a standard. There can be exceptions. You can do a Master of Engineering in, say, 1 year. So that's also possible. But then 1 year means that you're not spending time on an internship. And if you don't do an internship, then it's less likely for you to get a job later. Or you can do a hybrid model where you do an MS and get out within 1.5 years. So you do an internship and then do one more semester and get out. A lot of clauses involved, so it's a really tricky scenario. The other thing I would say is that when I say MS degrees do not get funding, it doesn't mean that nobody gets funding. It just means that majority of students will not get funded as soon as they go there. So most students have to finish at least one semester in the US before they get funding. And I know that around 30 to 35% of students do get funding after the first semester, especially in computer science. And another, say, 25% also gets funding by the end of the first semester, first year, which is 2 semesters. So they do get funding. So by the end of the first year, I would say maybe around 65% of students have gotten funding. It doesn't mean everyone gets funding. It just means the majority of students get funding. Around 35% of students will still not get funding at the end of the first year. So you will have to pay for your entire tuition from your own pocket. So you have to bear that in mind when you select for degrees and where is it you want to end up. The other thing I would say is, if you're looking at the job market, there are some places where there are a lot of Indians. For example, Indians tend to be in places like Chicago. They tend to be in places like the Desi population, India Desi population. They tend to be New York, New Jersey. They tend to be in Silicon Valley, Bay Area, Seattle, Austin, all these places. So again, being in the places where Indians are just makes it more comfortable for you to settle down. So that's also something for you to look at. In terms of shortlisting universities, the best tip I would offer to you is go forward, look at all these academic rankings. And I pretty much recommend only one academic ranking very seriously, which is the Shanghai World Rankings. It's done by Shanghai Jiaotong University, and it captures the top 500 universities or top 1,000 universities in the world. So go down to engineering and look at all the universities, filter down by US, and try to understand what the top rankings are. Also look at usnews.com. That's another website where you get a lot of information about universities. So every university is going to be a little different, but then as you read about the universities, locations, with job prospects, and so on, you get a good feel of which college to apply for and which not to apply for. For example, if you hear a name like UMTC, it means University of Minnesota Twin Cities. If you hear OSU, it means Ohio State University. Likewise, ASU means Arizona State University. So all these abbreviations, you'll only learn if you spend more and more time trying to read up about the universities. So the more homework you do, the better it's going to be. Okay, I'm going to close here and move on to other questions later. But if you have questions, let me know in the comments below. Till next time, cheers.